Nora Voss wanted a schoolteacher. What arrived in Silver Gulch was something closer to a reckoning. Prentiss Aldrich had been teaching in Philadelphia when the letter came. She'd answered the posting herself. School District of Harwick County, Colorado seeks qualified instructor for mining camp school, room and board provided, salary modest but reliable. Not because she was desperate for work, but because she was desperate for distance. 300 miles of distance, to be specific. Enough to put between herself and her brother-in-law, who'd been making quiet, persistent arguments about why a widow of 29 had no business managing her late husband's estate alone. She packed 2 trunks. She told no one where she was going except her lawyer, a cautious man named Briggs who promised discretion and charged accordingly. She took the train to Denver, the stage to Creston, and a supply wagon the last 14 miles up into the mountains, arriving in Silver Gulch on a Tuesday afternoon covered in red dust and absolutely certain she'd made the right decision. The town was smaller than she'd expected. One main street, a saloon that doubled as the post office, a general store with a covered porch where 3 old men sat arguing about fence disputes, a church that looked like it had been built in a hurry and never quite finished. And at the far end of the street, a single-room schoolhouse with 4 windows and a bell that hung slightly crooked above the door. Nora Voss, the school board chairman's wife, met her at the wagon, a broad-shouldered woman in her 50s with the kind of face that had stopped apologizing for itself decades ago. She looked Prentiss over the way a rancher looks at livestock, not unkindly, just appraising. "Miss Aldrich?" "Mrs. Aldrich," Prentiss said. She didn't elaborate. Let them assume whatever was simpler. Nora's expression shifted slightly. She noted the correction, filed it somewhere, and moved on. "We weren't expecting someone quite so." She paused, searching for the word young. "I'm 29. I meant that in the best possible way. Come on then. I'll show you the house." The house was a small 2-room affair attached to the back of the schoolhouse, which meant Prentiss would be 12 feet from her work at all times. She'd expected worse. She'd lived worse, though not by much, in the years after Thomas died and before she understood how far his brother Garrett's ambitions reached. The school had 11 students ranging from 6 to 16. She learned their names the first morning, their situations by the end of the week. Mining families, mostly. Fathers who worked 12-hour shifts underground and came home gray with dust and too tired to argue. Mothers who stretched everything thin and asked no questions that didn't have answers. Children who were either furiously curious or completely checked out, no middle ground. She liked them. That was the thing she hadn't expected. She'd been a good teacher in Philadelphia, competent and thorough, but she'd never particularly loved the work. Here, she loved it. Maybe because the stakes were different. These kids had nowhere else to be educated, no other options if she failed them. Or maybe because she finally understood what it felt like to need an escape route, and education was one of the only reliable ones. She'd been in Silver Gulch 3 weeks when she met Brennan Cole. He came into the schoolhouse on a Thursday evening while she was grading papers. Knocked on the door frame even though the door was already open, which she would later understand was characteristic. A man who announced himself even when he didn't have to. He was taller than the doorway by about an inch, which he'd clearly learned to account for. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard trimmed close, the kind of weathered face that came from years in mountain weather rather than hard living. He held his hat in both hands, which she would also later understand was not deference but habit. "Mrs. Aldrich, my name's Brennan Cole. I run the Copper Ridge operation 3 miles east." She set down her pen. She'd heard the name. The coal mine employed about a third of Silver Gulch's fathers, which made Brennan Cole one of the more significant people in the valley whether he wanted to be or not. "Mr. Cole, what can I do for you?" "My son's in your school, Denny, the tall one in the back row." She knew Denny, 14, suspicious of everyone, doing work about 3 grades below his capability because no one had pushed him. She'd started pushing him that week. He mentioned you'd given him additional assignments. She waited for the complaint that seemed to be coming. "He did them," Cole said after a pause. "All of them. He came home and did them the same night without being asked." He held out a folded paper. "I wanted to bring this back. He found it on his own. Said you'd mentioned something about it in class." It was a surveying diagram. She'd talked briefly about land measurement as a way to connect mathematics to something the kids could see themselves using. She hadn't expected anyone to follow up. "He's capable of a great deal more than he's doing," she said. Someone should have told him that before now. Cole was quiet for a moment. Maybe so. He looked at the diagram, then at her. What's he capable of? So she told him. Not flattery. Facts. What Denny could understand, how quickly he grasped things, what he'd need if he was going to go anywhere beyond Silver Gulch. Cole listened without interrupting, turning his hat slowly in his hands. When she finished, he nodded. "Thank you." He started to leave, then stopped. "Are you settling in all right? Nora Voss said you came from Philadelphia." She recognized the question behind the question. People in small towns always wanted to know why you'd come, what you were running from, whether you'd be staying. I needed a change of scenery, she said. It was true as far as it went. He looked at her steadily. The mountains take some adjusting to. I expect they do. He left. She went back to her grading. But she sat there for a few minutes after the last lamp in the street went out, not reading anything, just thinking about the way he'd listened. She told herself it didn't mean anything. She was good at telling herself things. October came and the temperature dropped fast. The students started showing up with frost on their collars, and she wrote a note to the school board asking about repairs to the door seal. Nora's husband, Edwin Voss, came personally to fix it, which told her something about how the board operated. She filed that information away with the rest. She also filed away the fact that Brennan Cole started stopping by the schoolhouse roughly once a week. Sometimes with a question about Denny, sometimes with firewood that he'd leave stacked by the back door without mentioning it, once with a broken chair that he'd seen through the window and taken home to repair. He always knocked. He never stayed more than 15 minutes. She was not naive enough to think this was entirely about the firewood. In November, things shifted. She was walking back from the general store on a Friday afternoon when she saw the man. She noticed him the way she'd trained herself to notice things in the past 2 years. Peripheral assessment, quick catalog, expensive coat for Silver Gulch, boots not broken in for mountain terrain, eyes that moved too carefully for a casual traveler. He was standing outside the saloon watching the street with the patient attention of someone who was being paid to wait. She kept walking. She bought her flour and her lamp oil. She went back to the schoolhouse and locked the door, which she didn't usually do in the middle of the afternoon. That evening she wrote a letter to Briggs in Philadelphia. She didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for people who had better options. She simply asked as calmly as she could whether there had been any inquiries about her whereabouts. His response came 12 days later. Yes, there had. Garrett Aldrich had hired an inquiry firm out of Chicago. They'd been thorough. She sat with that for a long time. Then she burned the letter and went to teach school the next morning, because 11 children were waiting, and that didn't change. The man was still in town. She'd seen him twice more, both times positioned where he could watch the main street without being watched. His name, she learned from the general store clerk, was Finch. He'd told people he was scouting potential mining claims, which was plausible enough that most people believed it. She didn't. Brennan Cole stopped by on a Thursday, later than usual. She could see in the way he came through the door that he'd heard something. He had the look of a man carrying a question he hadn't decided whether to ask. She saved him the trouble. There's a man in town named Finch, she said, without looking up from the papers she was marking. He's not a mining scout. Cole was quiet. He works for a firm in Chicago. My brother-in-law hired them to find me. Still quiet. I'm not in any legal trouble, she said. My husband died 2 years ago and left his estate to me. Garrett has been disputing that through every avenue he can find, and now apparently through physical presence. She set down her pen. She'd practiced this. She'd known she might have to say it out loud at some point, and she'd rehearsed a version that was factual and unemotional and covered the necessary ground without requiring anything from the listener. He sat down in the student chair closest to her desk. It was too small for him, which would have been almost funny under different circumstances. What does he want? He asked. Control of the estate. If he can establish that she paused, finding the right word, unstable or irrational or incapable of managing my own affairs, he can petition a court to appoint himself administrator. On what grounds? On the grounds that I left a perfectly good life in Philadelphia to teach school in a Colorado mining camp. She kept her voice even. Some judges would find that compelling. Cole looked at the room around them. The small stove, the crooked bell visible through the window, the 11 names written on the board in her careful script. What do you need? The question was so direct she almost didn't know what to do with it. She'd been preparing for skepticism, for polite distancing, for the kind of careful non-involvement that was easier and more sensible. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I'm still assessing. He nodded, like that was a reasonable answer. Let me know when you do. He stayed another 20 minutes. They talked about Denny, about a new vein the coal mine had found, about whether the coming winter would close the mountain road. When he left, she sat for a long time in the quiet schoolroom, listening to the wind come down off the peaks, feeling the specific weight of someone knowing the truth and not running from it. Finch made his move in December. She came back from the store to find him waiting on her porch. He'd made himself comfortable in the one chair she'd put out there in the optimistic weeks of September. He stood when she approached, which was either courtesy or performance, probably both. Mrs. Aldrich. He had a pleasant voice, the kind that was professionally neutral. I represent Garrett Aldrich of Philadelphia. I believe you know why I'm here. She stood at the bottom of her own steps and looked at him steadily. What do you want? Mr. Aldrich would like to resolve this matter without legal proceedings. He's prepared to offer you a very generous settlement in exchange for relinquishing administrative control of the Aldrich estate. My husband left that estate to me. He did, and you've managed it. Finch paused, choosing his word, unconventionally. The money is being held by your Philadelphia solicitor while Mr. Aldrich's petition works through the courts. In the meantime, you're living on a school teacher's salary in a mining camp. He spread his hands like this was simply information. Mr. Aldrich's offer is more than fair. Tell him no. Finch didn't blink. Mrs. Aldrich, with respect, I said no. She climbed her steps, stopped with her hand on the door. Now get off my porch. He left. He'd expected something else, tears maybe, or negotiation, the kind of wavering that would give him something to work with. She gave him nothing, but she sat inside for an hour afterward with her hands wrapped around a cold coffee cup, because she was shaking and she needed to get that out of her system before she could think clearly. Garrett wasn't going to accept the no. She knew him. He had her father-in-law's instincts and none of his restraint, which made him both more aggressive and less careful. Finch would go back, and Garrett would send something worse. She needed to think about what came next. Cole found her the following morning, still at her desk at 7 a.m. She'd worked through most of the night trying to map out options. He came with coffee in a pot, which told her Nora Voss had already talked to him, which told her small-town information moved faster than she'd accounted for. He poured without asking, she accepted without arguing. They sat on opposite sides of her desk. He made an offer, she said. I heard. She looked up sharply. Nora has sources everywhere, Cole said without particular apology. Her expression must have shown something, because he added, she's on your side for what it's worth. Half the town is, she let that settle. She wasn't accustomed to people being on her side. Not lately. He's going to file a competency petition, she said. Her brother-in-law. He tried twice in Philadelphia and the judge wasn't sympathetic, so now he's going to try to establish that moving here proves she caught herself, that it proves I'm irrational, unable to make sound decisions. Cole was quiet for a moment. Can he win? He has money and connections and a narrative that sounds reasonable if you don't look too closely. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. I have a good lawyer in the truth. Those things don't always balance out. What would make it balance? She looked at him. He was watching her with the same steady attention he always brought, which was the thing about him that she'd stopped being able to dismiss. He didn't look away from hard things. If I were married, she said carefully, it would complicate his claim considerably. A competency petition against a married woman requires the husband's participation, or at minimum his non-objection. Garrett doesn't have either. Cole said nothing. I'm not asking you for anything. She wanted to be clear about that. I'm just explaining the situation as it stands. She looked back at her papers. I'll find another path. He was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, someone's horse moved on the frozen road. What would it require? He asked finally. For it to be legal. She met his eyes. County courthouse. Judge Harwick. 2 witnesses. About 45 minutes of paperwork. He turned his hat in his hands. Same old habit, Denny would need to know. Yes, he nodded once. Slow. The kind of nod that landed like a commitment. I'll talk to him tonight, Cole said. Denny Cole was 14 years old and had his father's directness without his father's patience for letting things unfold. He appeared at the schoolhouse door that same evening, hands shoved in his pockets, expression carefully neutral in the way of boys who didn't want anyone to see them hoping for something. He said you need to get married, Denny someone. He paused. To him. She set down her chalk. I explained the situation to your father, yes. He offered to help. It would be your household too, which is why your opinion matters. Denny was quiet. He looked at the room, at the board with his name on the assignments list, at the surveying diagram pinned near the window. Do you like him? He asked finally. She considered lying. Then she considered that Denny had caught her in 2 half-truths already, and she needed him to trust her more than she needed this to be uncomplicated. I respect him considerably, she said. Which isn't the same thing, but it's not nothing. He's been a lot better since you started, Denny said. Quieter. More, he searched for the word present. He comes home and talks about things. Before you came, he mostly just sat. She hadn't known what to do with that information, so she filed it. Denny looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded. Okay, he said, and left. She stood there after he'd gone, listening to the quiet, trying to decide what she felt. She'd gotten good at not feeling things, which had been necessary for survival. It was harder in practice than in theory. They married on a Friday morning in Judge Harwick's office above the general store. Nora Voss and Edwin came as witnesses. Nora had brought flowers from somewhere, dried ones tied with a bit of ribbon, and set them on the judge's desk without being asked. The ceremony took 12 minutes. Cole said I do in the same tone he used to say everything, which was to say like he meant it. She said the same words and tried to put the same weight behind them. Walking back to the schoolhouse after she'd kept her house, the arrangement made practical sense. She looked at the ring on her hand, a plain gold band that had been his mother's, and tried to calculate the distance between the person she'd been 6 months ago and the person she was now. The calculation kept coming out wrong. She wasn't sure if that was a problem. Finch left Silver Gulch 2 days after the wedding. He'd done his job, which was to assess the situation, and the situation had changed. She imagined him writing his report to Garrett, imagined Garrett's face when he read it, and felt something she recognized after a moment as satisfaction. It didn't last. She'd known it wouldn't. The letter from Garrett arrived in January. She read it alone, at the kitchen table in the house she now shared with Cole and Denny, while the first real blizzard of winter came in off the peaks. He wasn't giving up. He'd found a lawyer in Denver who specialized in marriage law, and he had a new argument, that the marriage was fraudulent, contracted not from genuine intent but as a legal strategy to evade his petition. If he could establish that, the petition would proceed and the marriage could be dissolved. She set the letter down, picked it up again, put it in the stove. Cole came in from the barn half an hour later, stomping snow from his boots. He took one look at her face. What happened? She told him. She told him all of it, more than she'd told him before, about the full scope of Thomas's estate, about the 2 years of petitions and counter-petitions, about the specific legal argument Garrett was apparently planning to make. She'd been parceling out information until now, giving him only what he needed. She stopped doing that. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down across from her. He's arguing the marriage isn't real, Cole said. Yes. Is he wrong? She looked at him. It was the most direct question she'd ever been asked, and she'd been asked a number of direct questions in the past 2 months. It was real in its intent, she said carefully. We both knew what we were doing and why. That's not what I asked. The wind came down off the mountain and hit the side of the house. She felt it in the walls. I don't know, she said. That's the honest answer. He nodded like he'd expected that. I've been thinking about it, he said, since you told me about the letter. I've been thinking that I don't know either, but I know the difference between going through motions and meaning something. He met her eyes. I meant it. Whatever the original reason was, I meant it. She felt something behind her sternum shift, the way a door opens that you'd convinced yourself was locked. I'm going to have to testify, she said, about why I came here, about whether my choices were rational or whether I was in some kind of crisis. Were you? She thought about that. About Philadelphia and the house that had felt like a cage with good furniture. About Garrett's patient, reasonable-sounding arguments for why she should sign over what Thomas had left her. About the moment she'd seen the school posting and felt, for the first time in a year, the possibility of somewhere else. I was running, she said, but not from fear. From a situation I couldn't change any other way. That's different, yes, Cole said. It is. They got their own lawyer in February. His name was Sullivan, a man from Cheyenne who'd ridden up on the first clear road of the year with a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers called unwinnable. He was 50-something, thin as wire, with the eyes of someone who'd seen the inside of too many courtrooms to be impressed by any of them. He interviewed Prentiss for 3 hours the first afternoon. He asked questions she hadn't expected, about her marriage to Thomas, about her relationship with Garrett before Thomas died, about the specific nature of the estate dispute and what Garrett stood to gain. He asked about her reasons for coming to Silver Gulch, her professional record in Philadelphia, her current relationships in the community. Then he asked about her relationship with Cole. She described it honestly. The pragmatic beginning, the gradual accumulation of trust, what Denny had said about his father becoming more present. Sullivan looked at her for a long moment. You're not in love with him, he said. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer immediately. That's a complicated question. Courtrooms prefer simple answers. Then, I don't know yet, which is different from no. Sullivan wrote something in his notebook. Good, he said, that I can work with. The hearing was set for March in Denver. 2 weeks out, Garrett arrived in Silver Gulch himself. She saw him from the schoolhouse window. She'd been watching for him since January, the way you watch for weather you know is coming. He rode up the main street on a horse that cost more than most families in Silver Gulch made in a year, and he looked at the town with the expression of a man who found it adequately beneath him. He was 42, 7 years older than Thomas would have been, with their father-in-law's sharp face and something in the eyes that had always made her careful. Thomas had said Garrett was simply ambitious. She had learned that ambitious and ruthless were not actually synonyms, but they sometimes shared an address. He came to the schoolhouse that afternoon. She made him wait outside until she'd finished the lesson, which she suspected irritated him considerably. Good. When she came out, he was standing in the cold, looking at the building with an expression she couldn't quite read. She wondered if he was surprised by her,
by the reality of the place, the kids, the life she'd made here.
He'd probably imagined something smaller.
Prentiss, he said. Garrett, you look well. He said it like it was slightly inconvenient. This he gestured at the schoolhouse, the town, the mountains behind it. Is not what I expected. I imagine not. I've reviewed the marriage certificate. His voice dropped into the register he used for business, careful, measured. The voice that said, I'm being reasonable, the unreasonableness is yours. It was filed 6 weeks after you arrived here. That's not a long time to know someone.
Long enough. The courts may feel differently. That's their prerogative.
She kept her hand still, her voice even. She'd had 2 months to prepare for this conversation. She'd done the preparation.
I know what you're trying to establish, Garrett. I know the argument you're making. I want you to hear this clearly. I am not coming back to Philadelphia. I am not signing over Thomas's estate. I am not going to give you what you want. You can spend whatever you're willing to spend on lawyers, and the answer will be the same. His jaw tightened. You're being obstinate. I'm being clear.
There's a difference. What does your husband think about all this? He said husband with a very small, very precise amount of contempt.
Does he understand what he's gotten himself into? Ask him yourself. I intend to.
He looked at her for a long moment. Prentiss, I'm not the villain you've made me into.
I'm trying to protect the family's interests. The family, she said quietly, was Thomas. Thomas is dead. What you're trying to protect is your own claim. Something moved through his expression. She'd called it close enough to true that it landed, and then it was gone. He settled his hat and walked back toward the hotel. She stood on the steps of the schoolhouse breathing mountain air until her hands stopped shaking. Cole had been watching from across the street. He came over without hurrying.
I heard most of it, he said. He's going to push hard in Denver. Yes. She looked at him.
At the man she'd married for practical reasons who had, somewhere between November and February, become something else. She didn't have clean language for it yet. She was working on it.
I know, she said. Let him. The drive to Denver took 2 days.
Sullivan rode with them, reviewing the case out loud in the evenings, while Denny, who had absolutely refused to stay home, sat beside the fire listening with the focused attention he brought to surveying diagrams. Sullivan laid out the strategy plainly. Garrett's case rested on 2 arguments, that Prentiss's decision to come to Silver Gulch was irrational, and that the marriage was a legal maneuver rather than a genuine union. Their job was to dismantle both. The first argument, Sullivan said, is actually the weaker one. Leaving a contested situation to build independence elsewhere is rational by any reasonable standard. We'll demonstrate that through her professional record, her standing in the community, her management of school finances. He glanced at Prentiss, which I understand you've also been handling. She had been. Edwin Voss had asked her in December. She'd reorganized the district accounts and found 2 years of billing errors within a week. The second argument is harder, Sullivan continued. A marriage of convenience is not automatically invalid, but Garrett's lawyer will try to paint it as a transaction, not a union.
We need people who've observed this family to speak to what they've actually seen. Denny cleared his throat. I could do that. Sullivan looked at him. Yes, you could. He's 14, Prentiss said. He's a witness, Sullivan said, and he's credible.
Kids who testify in court get more weight than most people expect because they tend to say exactly what they know and nothing else. Cole looked at his son. You sure? Denny shrugged, which from him was a yes. The courthouse in Denver was larger than the one in Creston, and significantly more intimidating, which she suspected was intentional. Garrett's lawyer, a silver-haired man named Aldous Crane, moved through the room with the easy confidence of someone who'd never had reason to doubt his welcome anywhere. She had faced worse things. She reminded herself of that sitting at the defense table, watching Crane arrange his papers with the precision of a man performing competence for an audience. Sullivan was less theatrical and more surgical. He'd told her this was his preference. Theater impresses the gallery, he'd said. Surgery wins cases. The hearing opened with Crane laying out Garrett's position in terms that were, she had to admit, well-crafted. Prentiss Aldrich had abandoned her late husband's estate, her social network, her professional position, and her place of residence within 18 months of his death. She had traveled to a remote location, entered into a hasty marriage with a man she barely knew, and continued to resist all reasonable efforts by her family to provide oversight and stability during what was clearly an emotionally compromised period. He made grief sound like a legal liability. She noted that and filed it. Sullivan's opening was 3 minutes long and contained, she counted, 0 ornamental phrases. Prentiss Cole, he said. She had taken Cole's name, which Crane had not, is a credentialed educator with 8 years of professional experience and a record that speaks for itself. She made a deliberate, planned decision to relocate, secured legitimate employment before her arrival, and has conducted herself as a contributing member of the Silver Gulch community since the day she arrived. The only thing unusual about her situation is that she did all of this while her brother-in-law was simultaneously attempting to strip her of assets her late husband intended her to keep. He looked at the judge, a stout man named Reyes, who had the eyes of someone who'd seen this kind of case before and hadn't particularly enjoyed it. The question before this court is not whether Mrs. Cole made unconventional choices. The question is whether unconventional means irrational, and whether a woman's choice to build an independent life constitutes sufficient grounds for a man to take control of that life away from her. Crane objected.
Reyes let Sullivan finish. She testified for almost 2 hours. Crane was skilled.
He asked questions that sounded reasonable and contained small hidden edges, the kind that could open into something damaging if you weren't careful. She was careful. She'd been trained by 18 months of managing Garrett to be careful. He asked about her reasons for leaving Philadelphia. She told him, a contested estate, a hostile domestic situation, a professional opportunity that allowed her to build independence. He asked if those were the actions of a stable person. She said they were the actions of a person solving a problem with the tools she had. He asked if she'd been in love with Cole when she married him. She paused, which Sullivan had told her not to do, but she couldn't help it. I didn't know him well enough to be in love with him, she said, but I knew him well enough to trust him, and I found that trust is a better foundation than most things. Crane's expression suggested this was not the answer he'd wanted. Cole testified after her. He sat in the witness box like a man sitting at his own kitchen table, which was either natural composure or a kind of practiced calm she recognized from her own life, the deliberate choice to not give away what you were feeling until you were somewhere safe. Crane asked him why he'd agreed to marry someone he'd known for 6 weeks. Cole thought about it. Because she was honest about why she needed help, he said, and because I thought I could provide it. I've known people my whole life who asked for help through 40 different angles before getting to the point. She came straight to the point. That seemed like a good sign. Crane asked if the marriage was primarily a legal transaction.
It started as a practical arrangement, Cole said. Most things worth having start practical. You build the rest.
What have you built? Crane asked, with a tone that suggested he expected nothing. Cole looked at him steadily. My son is doing work 2 grades above his level because she pushed him. I come home to a house that feels like a house instead of a place I'm staying. I've had someone to talk to for the first time in 4 years. He paused. That's not nothing. That's most of what matters.
Denny testified last. Sullivan had prepared him but not over-prepared him, which was the right call. He sat in the box with his hands in his lap and answered questions the way he did everything. Directly, without decoration. Does your father seem happy? Sullivan asked him. Denny considered this. He seems like himself again, he said. Before, he searched for the word muted, like he was doing everything but not really in it. He tilted his head slightly.
That's gone now. Reyes called a recess after Denny stepped down. When he came back, his expression was the same as before, unreadable, settled. She'd spent 2 days watching him try to read him and had come up with nothing. The ruling was brief. Reyes found no sufficient grounds to question Prentiss Cole's competency. He found the marriage legally valid and entered in good faith by both parties. He denied Garrett Aldrich's petition for administrative oversight in its entirety. He did add one note which Sullivan had warned her might happen. The estate dispute itself was separate from the competency question and would need to proceed through the appropriate channels. That fight wasn't over, but she had the tools now to fight it from solid ground. Garrett stood when the ruling was read. He said nothing. He didn't look at her. He walked out with Crane behind him and didn't look back. She understood that he wasn't finished. Men like Garrett were never finished. But she also understood that he'd lost the angle that mattered most. He couldn't touch what was hers. Outside the courthouse, Sullivan shook her hand, and then Cole's, which he seemed to find slightly awkward, and then Denny's, which seemed to surprise Denny. This isn't over, Sullivan said. She knew. I know, but we've established the ground. Everything he tries from here will be uphill. Cole stood beside her in the afternoon light. Denny was a few steps away, looking at the street with the expression of a boy filing away everything he was seeing, which she recognized because she'd been doing the same thing all her life. She felt a hand find hers. Not reaching, not dramatic. Just there. She held on. The drive back to Silver Gulch took 2 days, the same as coming, but the weight was different, less like carrying something and more like having set it down. Sullivan had been right. The ground was established now. Whatever came next, she'd be fighting from solid footing. Denny rode most of the second day with her, which she suspected wasn't accidental. He asked her about the surveying diagrams he'd been studying, whether they were accurate for mountain terrain, and she told him they weren't and explained why, and he listened and then asked 3 more questions that were better than the first one. She answered all of them. By the time they came over the last rise and she saw the valley again, The crooked bell on the schoolhouse visible from half a mile, the smoke from the smelter, the peaks behind everything going orange in the late light. She felt something she needed a moment to identify.
She was glad to be back. That was new.
Silver Gulch moved on the way small towns do, absorbing what happened and continuing. Nora Voss organized a supper that somehow became a celebration, though no one officially called it that. Tom Fletcher played fiddle enthusiastically and badly. Edwin made a speech that was too long and entirely sincere. She stood at the edge of it all, watching, still slightly unused to being the kind of person a town wanted to celebrate. Cole found her there. He handed her a cup of coffee and stood beside her, looking at the room.
"How are you?" he asked. "Better," she said. "Honestly, better."
He nodded. She looked at him. At the man who had sat in a courtroom in Denver and said that's most of what matters without any performance in it. At the man whose son had told her, in the most 14-year-old way possible, that his father had come back to himself.
"I owe you something," she said. "You don't."
"I mean an answer to a question you asked in January." He waited. "I said I didn't know yet," she said. "About whether it was real. She looked at the room, at Nora's flowers on the table, at Denny across the way explaining something with his hands in the air. "About whether I meant it." She looked back at him.
"I mean it."
He looked at her for a moment. Steady and present in the way that had been, she understood now, what she'd been trusting from nearly the beginning. Then he said, "I know. I've been watching you figure it out." She laughed, which surprised her. He smiled, which surprised her more, not because she'd never seen him smile, but because of what it meant when he did. He was selective about it. It meant something. She didn't have all the answers yet. She didn't have the estate dispute resolved, or the full measure of what she'd built here, or the clean language for what she and Cole were to each other. She had the ground.
She had the next day and the day after that, and the work, and the mountain light, and a boy who asked better questions every week, and a man who sat down in a too small chair and said, "Let me know what you need like."
It was the simplest thing.
It was the simplest thing.
She was still learning to believe that.
Outside, the peaks held the last light of the day the way they always did, the way they would tomorrow, certain and enormous and completely indifferent to anyone's plans. She'd spent 2 years fighting to get somewhere she could stand still.
She'd found it somewhere she'd never thought to look, which seemed about right. The best things rarely announced themselves. She was here. She was staying. That was enough for now. It turned out it was also more than enough.